Judith Bukenya, and my co-host David Chirabida is away from the studio but with us in spirit. And so I thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I want to also welcome my guest, Professor Milton Alimadi. Milton, thank you for coming back to the show.
It's my pleasure as always, comrade.
How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for asking. I hope you're doing well too.
Yes, very well here in the Boston area. We've been dealing with a lot of gloomy weather. I think it's probably about the same there with you.
Yes, it is. It's not raining though. It's kind of dark cast. It could rain. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
But thankfully, it's not that cold. So I'm happy.
There's no snow. There's no snow as of yet.
Right.
So I want to start off with our first conversation topic, and it's the possible recolonialization of Africa, recolonization of Uganda, specifically to our conversation. Recently this week, Uganda signed a $200 million loan agreement with Exim Bank China to upgrade Entebbe Airport. The finance minister did admit that there were some loan terms that were unfair, they were not really agreeable. And Uganda's Entebbe Airport is due to receivership of that loan from China. Now, according to Uganda's Auditor General's report from January 2019, Uganda's public debt from June 2017 to 2018 rose from 9.1 billion to 11.1 billion. That report, without naming China at the time, warned that if Uganda continued to place conditions on major loans, this would put the sovereignty of Uganda in jeopardy. And it is said that in some parts of loans, whether with China or with other banks, that Uganda has agreed to waive sovereignty of certain properties. So my first question for you, Milton, is what would receivership of an airport mean for the country? Like, are we seeing a pathway for recolonialization, or will it look different?
Well, I sort of have a bit of a different take on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Uganda was actually ever decolonized, you know? Uganda is a colony. It's a colony of the West, and now China is becoming a new player on the scene. So now Uganda is a colony of both the West and of China. If you look at it carefully, it might actually be much more efficient to have them run the airport. I mean, they run everything already anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And I say think something like this galvanizes Ugandans into finally realizing that we are not really an independent country. The West, they do it a little more subtly, you know? So it's possible for you to actually deceive yourself into believing you are independent.
Mm-hmm.
You're not independent. But the Chinese do it a little more blatantly. They say if the money is not paid, this asset belongs to us.
Right.
So you had the example of Zambia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Remember in Zambia, they had to mortgage the utilities. Think about that. Because they could not pay the loan. And Zambia became the first African country during this era of the pandemic. I believe that was in November 2020. And the biggest portion of that money that Zambia defaulted on, the loan, belongs to China. You see? Zambia was asking China and the other countries, oh, let's renegotiate this package. And they declined. You know, so Zambia now is potentially, if not already, losing its major assets in terms of the utility company, right? Mm-hmm. And now Zambia has defaulted on the loan. And you know what happens when you default? When you default, you are no longer eligible for new financing. And no country in the world can survive without financing. That is why the economy of Zimbabwe has collapsed because Zimbabwe does not have access to new financing. So Uganda is in a bind, right? Mm-hmm. You have an illegitimate government, which is unpopular, and then you combine that with the level of corruption in all aspects of the Ugandan economy, and then you combine them with the pandemic. The pandemic has slowed down the economy. The tourism industry virtually wiped out because people were not traveling. Mm-hmm. Production has declined, meaning Uganda has less goods to sell to the world. Correct. Meaning revenue has also declined. And if you're in a position like that, let's say you, for example, if you lose your income, your revenue, you would accept loans on any condition pretty much. Is it not true?
Yes, out of desperation.
Especially if you have a government that wants to survive by any means necessary, mm-hmm. even a government which was actually defeated in an election, but insists on maintaining power in office by any means necessary. So yes, it's not surprising that the government would sign for loans from China, but actually, it's still in desperate trouble. You know why? Why? Because China knows how vulnerable the government is. China refused to lend, I believe it was $1.5 or $1.6 billion to Uganda to complete the railway, the gauge, standard gauge, mm-hmm. to run all the way from Kenya through Uganda. Mm-hmm. The Kenyan part was financed because they know Kenya's economy is in better shape. But Uganda's, they refused to finance that. So 200 million, that's peanuts compared to the 1.6 billion, which Uganda was expecting to get from China. Mm-hmm. So it's a good thing we are discussing this issue because it shows us how desperate the regime is, which in a way is not a very bad thing. It is a legitimate regime. And if some of these financial pressures can help bring down an illegitimate regime, it is not such a bad thing at all. It is. It's not such a bad thing. Ugandans should not so panic so much in terms of, oh, we are losing sovereignty to China, what have you. We never had sovereignty anyway. You know, we don't have sovereignty when the West controls our economy. Mm-hmm. The World Bank has been controlling us since independence. They lend you money, and then they say you cannot industrialize. Imagine, can you imagine the United States, anybody telling the United States, you can do these types of industries, you can do these types, but certain industries you cannot do. You cannot produce automobiles, for example. That's preposterous. Indeed. But that's what the West has been telling Uganda all this time and other African countries. But you know, because we don't know the details about it, we are like, oh, we are an independent country. You're not independent under those conditions. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, the only difference is China is not that subtle like the West. So they make it clear that you are not independent. And that is why people get very annoyed. But I'm saying they should get annoyed when the colonialism also comes from the West, not only from China. Let's get mad at both of them. Mm-hmm. That's my what I'm saying.
So then what would the response for the typical Ugandan be, given that, you know, there is no sovereignty, there's no ownership of just about anything? What would be what should be the response of the typical Ugandan on the ground, given that these conversations are had at the table?
The response should be, we need to do anything that the Constitution allows, and the Constitution allows a lot, by the way, right? Mm-hmm. To remove an illegitimate regime. That would be the best response, because until and unless we remove this illegitimate regime, we cannot begin the process to recover Uganda. You see, imagine, even Joe Biden, the president of the United States, which is a major partner, not really a partner, but a major source of revenue for the Ugandan regime, mm-hmm. said Uganda does not have a legitimate government. That was a statement by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State works for the President of the United States. And the Secretary of State said the elections were neither free nor fair. I don't know of any other example in recent memory where a U.S. Secretary of State said to any Ugandan election process that it was neither free nor fair. This is as explicit as it gets. In other words, if you translate it into simple English, it means Joe Biden is saying, you, General Yoweri Museveni, Kaguta, you are not the legitimate president of Uganda. But if you put it in diplomatic terms, then they say the elections were neither free nor fair. So Ugandans, we should feel, that's why he's doing all these desperate measures, you know? And us as Ugandans, we are obligated to rescue our country by removing this regime by any means allowed by the Constitution. And the Constitution goes beyond just election process alone. You know, the Constitution allows other activities that I don't need to enumerate in more explicit terms. Ugandans are clever people. They know what the Constitution allows for. So we should exercise that. I don't want anybody to say that I'm using the broadcast or social media waves to incite anybody. But I'm saying very clearly, read the Constitution. The Constitution says that if a ruler usurps the power, right, and the Constitution, then it is not a crime for any Ugandan, whatever action they take, to restore the Constitution. I think that's the best way I can put it without getting more explicit.
Indeed. So let's say tomorrow we usurp the president, or the, Kaguta Yoweri is no longer in power, but these loans have been signed. What then happens to the responsibility and the accountability of those who have to pay this loan back?
Very good question.
Does that become null and void? What then happens?
There are ways that we can make these null and void, because Uganda has a lot of resources and assets. You know, we can go to China or any other country that we have these questionable agreements with, right? And we can say we have these assets available, but you are not going to be eligible to do business with us on these assets unless we renegotiate this agreement, which we don't like. We don't like them because of A, B, C, D. You, China, you never let anybody have control of your airport in any city in China. So why do you expect that this should be acceptable to Ugandans? So we are not saying we are tearing this up, but we are saying in order for you to take interest in all these other business that we have, if you want to be a part of it, we want you to sit down with us and renegotiate these loans. So there are many flexible approaches that we can go by. Uganda has a lot of resources that China would be interested in being a part of, provided that all the agreements are above board and does not exploit the people of Uganda.
Thank you for that. I've actually been in conversations about things pertaining to how the government of Uganda is run, and one of the things that has been brought up in conversation is the dissolving of Uganda as a state, and East Africa as different states, but to have all the different East African countries come together as a conglomeration in order to make it possible for, of course, dictatorship to be impossible, but also for certain, banks to be able to lord it over different countries, such loans with such loopholes. What is your take on that? The dissolving of states?
That was the initial idea at the time of independence. Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, went to Jomo Kenyatta, he went to Milton Obote in Uganda, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and said, listen, I'm willing to delay the independence of Tanganyika. That's before it united with Zanzibar to become Tanzania in 1964. So this is 1960, saying Tanzania is about to become independent, but I can delay our independence if you agree that we become independent at the same time and form an immediate union. Unfortunately, I think it was particularly Kenyatta who was not so much interested in this. I think Obote might have been interested, but that never happened. Why? Because British capital primarily, which was located in Kenya, a lot of British businesses were telling Kenyatta, "Oh no, this is not a good idea." Why? Because East Africa Federation would be quite powerful, right? Britain would not be able to exploit these countries as opposed to Britain exploiting them when they're separate countries.
Yes.
When they're separate countries, their size is smaller, the market is smaller, their ability to come together and industrialize does not exist. See, because when you have a big market, like the East African market, right? Then they could decide on industrialization. They could say, Uganda, you produce automobiles, right? They could say, Kenya, you produce this kind of manufacture. Maybe you produce pharmaceuticals in Kenya, right? They go to Tanzania. Tanzania, you produce electronic equipment. See? So now you have specialization in each region. Uganda knowing if I produce cars, I have a big market, not only Uganda, the whole of East Africa.
That's right.
And grow even beyond East Africa. Kenya, the same thing for its pharmaceuticals. Tanzania, the same thing for electronics. That's why that was a brilliant idea, but it was so dangerous for Western capital. Because as you know, capitalist countries, they don't like competition. They don't like competition. Right. They talk about free market and all that. It's all nonsense. They don't like competition, you see? So now you have an East Africa Federation. If we produce cars, it means we are now competing with Britain, we're competing with the United States, we are competing with Asian countries, you see? That's not what they really want. So the idea of an East African Federation still remains a good idea. For that matter, the idea of an eventually United States of Africa remains a great idea, which might be consumed. So, and I say this to good, I didn't forget your question, but I'm saying there's a bigger benefit beyond just these loans into coming together as a federated East African Republic. The benefits are tremendous. It would really increase economic growth tremendously for all of East Africans, and all of us would benefit. And of course, as you alluded in your question, we would no longer have the problem of this dictator who's been in power for 35 years. And that, of course, is part of the problem. Tanzania has presidential term limits. Kenya has presidential term limits. Do you think these two countries are interested in forming a federation with a country which has a corrupt, a life president who has no idea what the law means? How can you call what we had an election when in November 2020, more than Ugandans were killed in a massacre? Is that how you conduct elections? Right. At that point, the whole process should have ended, you see? And then you have the election and the opposition comes and wins overwhelmingly. So overwhelmingly that even the United States, which normally gives Museveni a blank check, said the elections were neither free nor fair, which means Museveni did not win, which of course, in our own reading, it means the opposition won overwhelmingly. You see?
Yeah.
These are the issues we are dealing with. So the sooner we remove this guy, the sooner we start repairing our beloved country and moving forward.
Thank you for that deliberation. We started to talk about the standard gauge railway and how it's the most expensive railway in the world. Not because that's how much it costs to construct the railway, but you alluded to that where it begins in Kenya, that portion of the railway is accounted for and it's paid for. However, the portion in Uganda, Uganda hasn't paid for that. What is the likelihood of Uganda coming up with even more insidious, corrupt ways of avoiding responsibility for these loans? Because what they did was the government bought the land that the railway was going through. Right. Then they hiked up the prices so that they can, gain compensation for the land that was sold to the bank. So what would keep Uganda from doing the same thing, if not worse, with other people's loan or loans such as these?
Well, we know what's going to happen. You and I know. The money is going to be stolen, right? There's not been an instance where the government received substantial funds where the money was not stolen. When the IMF was talking about giving Uganda and the World Bank money to fight the pandemic last year, before the one that they got this year, we protested and we said the money is going to be stolen. It's going to be embezzled. I remember writing a letter to the World Bank and saying the money is going to be stolen. And they responded, they sent me something saying they're going to put measures to make sure the money is put to the use for which it was loaned. And I published the letter on the website. Anybody can Google it. It's, Google Black Star News, letter to World Bank about Uganda loan. And I published that letter, and it turned out to be all nonsense. The money was stolen. In fact, part of that money was diverted, as you know, for security purposes. The same security forces that were used to suppress violently Ugandan citizens during the election period. So it means, in fact, the killings by the regime was paid for by the World Bank. They have blood on their hands. So, but we continue the protest, as you know. I'm sure some of you and your colleagues were either aware of it or participate in some of the protests, because we all feel very strongly for our country. As a result of the protest, when the IMF released more money, I think it was about $1 billion in June, they now actually did come up with some conditions. They said, we are not going to give 1 billion immediately. We're going to break it up into, I think, 250 million parts and see how each piece is utilized before they disburse any further loans. And beyond that, we also, Ugandans, we did a great service on behalf of all of Africa. The Economist had an article about 2 or 3 weeks ago. It said the IMF is now putting conditions on all loans going to African countries. So, for example, it said it's going to pay careful attention to the money being given to Cameroon, to the money being given to Equatorial Guinea. And there were 2 other countries mentioned in that Economist article. This did not come out of the blue. The IMF did not just wake up one morning and said, oh, you know what? We hate corruption in Africa. So let's put some conditions. They remembered the multiple protests that Ugandan activists conducted. So these protests do yield fruit.
Yes.
And we are going to insist that after the first quarter, so now it's June, July, August, September, now we should go back and say, how much was the initial 250 million? How efficiently was it used in Uganda? Either way, we need to go back and continue our protest in front of the IMF and the World Bank, because now we've proven that it bears fruit. We're not going to stand around.
Milton, it looks like we lost you. I think we've lost Milton, but we're going to wait for him to come back. So I'll pick up where Milton left off, that what you in the diaspora are doing, you are protesting, you're writing, you are going to the IMF, you're going to your state house, your state houses, you're writing your senators and your representatives. It's working. It's working. So we're going to continue to keep the work alive. We're going to keep protesting. We were able to come together and liberate our comrade Lumbuye from prison. And he's out now, and we're still out to, free political prisoners in Uganda. We're still out to let the West know that Uganda must be held to account, that Museveni must be held to account for his actions towards the people of Uganda. Milton, you're back with us.
Yeah, sorry for that technical glitch. I think I was responding to your question about the standard gauge railway. And I gave you the larger response in terms of how we must respond to these loans being given to Uganda. And the other part of it is you spoke about the land, land speculation. Mm-hmm. You speculate anticipating that something is going to happen. But that thing is not going to happen. So they're going to be waiting for a long time for that money. The value, which was appreciated, anticipating that the rail was going to be built, they're going to wait for a very long time for that. Every country now has its own financial challenges. It's not easy to get more than $1 billion in loan. In fact, that is why the main source of financing has now become the World Bank and the IMF, because the countries came together and they realized that, see, this is the funny thing. Even though they developed industrialized countries, mm-hmm. they really don't want African countries to develop. And it makes sense, because if African countries develop, became like China, that's more competition.
That's right.
For the West.
Yes.
You see?
That's less
it makes sense,
them.
Right?
That's right.
So now we're going to be cutting into their profits. But they don't want us to collapse either. Because if we collapse, it means they cannot sell us their products, you see? Mm-hmm. So they came together and they approved billions of dollars in loans to every country, including the countries in Africa. So let's give them money so the economies can stay afloat, you see? Prevent collapse. Not to really develop them, mm-hmm. but prevent them from collapsing. Mm-hmm. So that's why the money is going to be available. And more money is going to be coming to countries like Uganda. That's why it is incumbent upon us, right, as Ugandans that care about our country, to be engaged at every stage with the World Bank and IMF. You're not going to loan money to this guy to use taxpayer money to kill Ugandan citizens. No. I think it's very difficult for us to stop money from going to Uganda. Mm-hmm. You see? There are many other corrupt regimes, even though Museveni is probably the most corrupt. Mm-hmm. There are brutal regimes, even though Museveni is the most brutal. But all of them are going to get some of this money to prevent the collapse of the global economy. So since the money is still going to be going to Uganda anyway, we must insist that the money be put to the use which it's intended for. And that's where our protests come into place. Whether we go physically to the office of the World Bank or IMF, or whether we do social media protests, they're very concerned about that as well. They are. And that's the power of social media. Mm-hmm. When you tweet these messages, I was very impressed when Ugandans would tweet and they would tag and use the hashtags of the president of the World Bank, the managing director of the IMF, mm-hmm. and they would attach photographs of those Ugandans who are being killed or tortured by dictator Museveni. So, once you do that, they're going to either see it themselves or their aides, colleagues are going to see them and start saying, wait, what's going on? What's going on in Uganda? You see, that is the power of social media, tweeting and Facebook. And please, any Ugandan listening to this, please continue participating in the social media protest. It has effect, and that is your contribution to the struggle.
Milton, will you share with our viewers your Twitter handle?
At Alimadi. My Twitter handle is at Alimadi. And I actually always welcome any engagement with other compatriots from all over the world. This is our country, and we will take back ownership from this dictator. He has no right to destroy the country for 35 years and then thinks he's going to pass it on to his son and his wife. That's not going to happen. Uganda's on the ground. You do your part, and we in diaspora, we will do our part. And it won't happen.
That's right. So I want.
And how do I know this? How do I know that they're feeling the pressure? Because they're sending people here who are trying to reach out to me,
really?
To reach out to me, to meet with me. Why do you want to meet? It's very simple. You have a legitimate government. Mm-hmm. Let the legitimately elected government take power. That's the only thing to discuss. You can't think you're going to meet with me and persuade me to do something. Mm-hmm. I don't need your money. I don't want your money, if that's what you were thinking about. I don't want any position in a legitimate government. Mm-hmm. And I hope other Ugandans feel the same way too.
Thank you for saying that. Really, thank you for saying that, because it really, I think it was a leadership coach of mine who said that you know the commitment of someone by where their feet are standing. And I think
Yes.
in our struggle, there's so many people who have been bought off, and it's a reflection of where their feet were always standing.
Yes.
So for you to articulate that you cannot and will not be bought off, you don't need anybody's money, you don't need anyone to convince you otherwise. It really speaks
Absolutely.
to your commitment, but also the commitment of other people who don't maybe have the opportunity to be on this show
Right.
to articulate such. So thank you for saying that and putting that on the record.
Right. Absolutely. Let's keep our eyes on the prize. The
That's
prize
right.
is worth it. The
That's
prize is
right.
worth it. Mm.
So I wanted to go to our next topic of conversation: the bombings in Uganda. So
Correct.
on the 23rd of this month at 9 p.m., a bomb exploded in a restaurant in Kampala, killing a waitress and injuring 3 other people. Then,
Correct.
3 days later, a suicide bomber blew himself up on a bus traveling between Masaka and Kampala, carrying about 52 passengers.
Correct.
3 people in that explosion were wounded, but only the person who was the suicide bomber was the only one who died. And he was later identified as a member of the Allied Democratic Forces,
Right.
which has opposed Museveni since 2016. The Islamic State also did claim responsibility for the October 23rd attack.
Correct.
So,
In the bar.
Milton, what I'm hearing is that there is a movement of Museveni's armed forces into the Congo, where there's the seat of the ADF after they were kicked out of Uganda. Do you think this is a justified movement of Museveni? I mean, given that recently on the 15th of October, Biden met with President Kenyatta to discuss regional transparency, vaccines, terrorism, and that Kenya right now is the president of the UN Security Council. Do you think that Museveni's movement into Congo is in retaliation for Biden not really being in partnership with him, and also the way that the West views Uganda right now?
Absolutely. Yes. The answer is yes. But, obviously we don't have the direct knowledge. The issue of the bombing in the bar and then in the bus, we can speculate, we can discuss. Obviously, we can say categorically that any explanation coming from General Museveni, we won't accept it. It's preposterous, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sad thing is, even when on the rare occasions that he might be telling the truth, he has told so many lies that most people would rather believe it's not true what he's saying.
He's the boy who cried wolf.
And that's a position he has
Yes.
earned,
Yes.
He has earned that because of his multiple documented lies. And on an occasion like this, I can remind people of the documented cardinal lies. This man said he would not run beyond the age of 74. It's on video. It was a TV interview. He said at that age, there's a question of mental acuity, right? So acknowledge that the mind is diminished. Yet what did he do? He beat MPs into allowing the age limit to be scrapped from the Constitution to allow him to continue as the ruler, even though his mind is finished. As he himself observed, that by that age, the mind is finished. I'm using his own words, you see?
Yeah.
So that was a cardinal lie. The biggest lie was to bring Ugandans together to come up with the Constitution, right? The brilliant Constitution, the beginning of our Constitution says that, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it says that we are writing this Constitution to ensure that henceforth going forward, we will never again suffer under a dictatorship. You see? So that's why people put in their intellectual input to produce that Constitution, which included, of course, the presidential term limit. What did he do? He removed that term limit. That's another big lie. Everything he says is a lie. So now when you have an incident like this, and whatever explanation they provide, you cannot blame anybody for not believing it. You see? So what you're saying is quite possible. It's quite possible that yes, maybe some people are responsible for this act of terrorism, correct? It's also 100% possible that General Museveni is behind these acts. You see? When Biden was finally pronounced as president of the United States, what was one of the first things the regime did? They claimed they had wiped out hundreds of al-Shabaab fighters in Somalia. This was an official statement from the armed forces of Uganda. It turned out no such military engagement occurred. It was manufactured completely. Yeah. Why? Because they were hoping to gain the attention of the Biden administration so that Biden would say, oh, we still need this guy to work with him in Somalia. So they came up with this elaborate fake story, completely concocted, you see? So when you have a regime capable of doing that, right? Why should we give any credibility to any explanation that they give concerning incidents like the one in the bar and the one in the bus? That's the first response to part of your question. The second part of your question is the regime trying to use this as a ruse to find a legitimate reason, or rationale rather, to go back into the Congo? That is also quite possible, but now there's a problem, because the United States has already officially said Museveni is illegitimate, right? His regime is illegitimate, so it's very difficult for the United States to be working with him in any new operation in any place in another African country. The United States might continue working with Ugandan forces in Somalia, because that is technically an African Union force, you see? So they could always find some sort of excuse. But technically, it's very difficult to find any explanation on how the US could engage with Uganda in any new military operation after you already said that the election was neither free nor fair, meaning you don't recognize Museveni as the legitimate president of Uganda. And the other problem is this: the United States, not really a problem, it's a good development, but it's a problem for Museveni. The United States is now fully engaged with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, not sitting on the fence, but fully engaged with President Felix Tshisekedi's government. They have, and they're fully engaged when they okay the IMF and World Bank to give you money, and they did. They okay these institutions to give money to Tshisekedi's government, which means they're on board with him. So they're not going to allow Museveni to go there and undermine the government of the Congo. In fact, Kenya is now involved also in the security measures in the Congo, which goes to what you said. They're shunning Museveni, and they're engaging Kenya, and they're engaging Democratic Republic of the Congo directly. So that's another indication. So the answer to your question is yes, he's trying to back himself, like a dog barking loudly into relevance again. He wants to become relevant. He wants to be a player. Even after 35 years, think about that. The man is just too much.
Interesting. So when regimes fall, when we look at the collapse of the USSR, when we look at the collapse of in Syria, not Syria, and Liberia.
Right.
Where do you see this regime is in their downward progression? I'm a registered nurse, and so I'm always looking for signs and symptoms of decline. Where do you see he is, where do you see this regime is in their downward decline, and how soon thereafter can we see a death to this regime?
It's very difficult to say these things, right? The world is very amazing. Look at Sudan, right? Al-Bashir in power all these years, and then suddenly, in all these years, the Sudanese are agitating against him to remove this dictator, right? And then it takes a combination of factors, including the economic pressure, escalating, people becoming much more emboldened and coming out. So that was a spark, and ultimately was removed. But nobody could have planned. It was removed with the protests beginning 2018 to 2019. But perhaps 2017, nobody could have said, "Oh, next year we're going to see incidents sparked leading toward the collapse of the Bashir regime." But all the signs were there. The economic pressure was there. The repression had escalated, targeting civilians, kidnapping civilians, murdering civilians, finding diversion for its armed forces,
Yeah.
All those elements are at play in Uganda, right? When your own government now starts attacking civilians, kidnapping young people, torturing young people, killing young people, to create a state of terror, thinking that is its only way of surviving. You think people are just going to sit back and accept that perpetually? Of course not.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that we don't know what incident would spark it, but it could be an incident or a number of incidents that would spark it, and people could just come out and say, it's time for you to go. Could you predict what might happen? You can't. You can't predict that, number one. Number two, the armed forces itself has pressure. You see, not everybody in the armed forces of Uganda is an incompetent coward. You see, there are elements in the armed forces who have also had enough. And why do I say this? When you have that blatant assassination attempt on General Katumba Wamala, that is not anything that was just out of nowhere. That can't be just a bunch of people sitting, eating muchomo and drinking and saying, you know what? Tomorrow, let's go and hit Wamala. It doesn't happen like that.
Right.
Every sensible person knows that this order came from the top, you see? So when you start thinking of eliminating your own generals, that's not a good sign. And other generals see this as well, you see? And the soldiers, the officers and the men, they see this as well. And that also escalates the disaffection within the armed forces itself, right? So all these elements are there. And in the Sudan, at some point, the armed forces joined with the people, and they brought an end to that dictatorship. Now there's some reactionaries who are trying to reverse this trend in the Sudan, but they won't succeed. It will be like in Burkina Faso, I think it was 2014, when, and I apologize if I get the year wrong, I'm not as young as you now. But anyway, the civilians came out and they drove Blaise Compaoré out of power, right?
Yeah.
And they wanted to create a new democratic environment. And then within a short period, another general who was still loyal to Blaise Compaoré seized power. The people came back out again. They drove that general out. And now the process of creating a more democracy continues in Burkina Faso. I think the same thing will happen in Sudan. This general, I don't see him lasting long. The Sudanese are resolute in the determination to create a new dispensation. So that will, that clique that is in power right now, temporary power, will also be removed. You can't reverse history. In Uganda, the same thing. You have a guy who's been there for 35 years. He's destroyed all the institutions of the country. He has normalized corruption, making it, celebrating corruption instead of people being ashamed of corruption. Think about this. A US court, federal court, in 2018 had a trial of a Chinese national, Jinping Patrick Ho, and convicted him for bribing Museveni and his foreign minister at the time, Sam Kutesa, $1 million. It sounds like not a lot of money, but that was to pave the way for more deals. And they wanted to get concessions in the oil industry for a Chinese company. But look at this other thing I want to point out. Inside the courtroom, They had the photograph of your president blown up, and they call him U.S. suspect number 1510 on the courtroom in the United States. Jurors looking at this. And they had another photograph, U.S. suspect exhibit number 1504. The foreign minister, Sam Kutesa, in the courtroom. People looking at this. And these are supposed to be the leaders of our country. We can't accept that. We can't. We can't accept that. You know?
Yeah.
So all the elements that might, that is very combustible. And to me, I don't see this regime going into another election in Uganda. I don't see that as possible. It's not possible. Now, the other element that you also raise, because in giving the example of Liberia, obviously you also are putting out a word of caution. We don't want to end up like Liberia. We don't.
That's right.
You see? But Liberia ended up the way it ended up is because for a long time, the armed conflict had been promoted, you know, all over the country. You see? We don't have that right now in Uganda compared to what Liberia had. You see? If
Liberia or Libya? Because I had said Libya.
You said Libya, okay.
Libya.
Fine. So let's go back to Libya. I thought you said Liberia. Libya, we don't want that either. We absolutely don't want Libya. We don't want our country to be destroyed like that. That is why I was a big opponent of the Western military invasion of Libya, because I did not see them as being able to create a better Libya. And it turns out that our analysis was correct. They did not like our analysis. We wrote many editorials condemning it, and we said, this is a matter for the Libyan people. If you want to put economic pressure, that's one thing, economic and financial pressure. But to send troops on the ground, no. I objected to that. I objected in fact, I'll tell you this quick story. I wrote one editorial, and I gave people phone numbers to call, because at that time, these so-called freedom fighters in Libya were killing Libyans that looked like you and me. They were targeting them, and then cutting off their head and putting it on YouTube. And I said, these are not the type of people that can create a new country. Of course, Noop is not like that.
Right.
You know, so I have every confidence that Noop can create the new Uganda that we need. And that is why people voted for them. And they won overwhelmingly. But let me go back to finish the story. So we wrote an editorial, and I gave the phone numbers. I said, call the New York Times and ask them, why are they not writing stories about this targeted killing of Libyans that look like you and me? I gave the phone number. I gave them phone number for the White House, and I told people, call the White House and ask them, why are they not condemning this targeted killing of Black Libyans just because we are supporting this invasion? I gave the number of the major organization, the NAACP, the number of the Urban League, the number of the State Department. And I think the editorial was getting some attention. You know why? Because first of all, our website was blocked for 3 days. By the time we got control of our website back, that editorial had been deleted. Think about that. You know? So it got attention. And at the end of the day, it turns out we were right. Look where Libya is today. And I say all this to come back to Uganda. I do not support any foreign elements coming to invade Uganda to remove Museveni. I believe that is our job.
That's right.
What we insist upon is that the West stop giving him weapons for killing Ugandans. Stop giving him this surveillance equipment that he uses to spy on Ugandan civilians and then arrest or kill them. You see? Stop aiding him in continuing his regime. But the job of removing him, we can do.
It's ours.
And that should be our job, so that we can create the kind of Uganda that we want. That is our responsibility. All we demand is you stop giving him military support, military aid, stopped training his soldiers, stopped training his officers. And now with the pressure, when they said the election was neither free nor fair, they also put out some visa restrictions. And they did not name some of the people on this visa ban list. And it would not be surprising if Museveni himself is on this list, and his son, who is now taking a major role in the repression of Ugandans, the killing of Ugandans, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba. He might also be on that list. People like Eli Tuwine definitely must be on that list. Even though the list has not been publicized in terms of whose name is on it, the list said it is against Ugandans who are involved in the violence and the stealing of the election. And we all know that Tuwine, Museveni, Kainerugaba, and many others were involved in this operation. So that's why we can safely believe that their names must be on that list. And we continue insisting that they add more names to that kind of list. So if they do that part and stop supporting him blatantly, I think it will also make our job a little bit easier.
Do you have an update on the is it Nominski Act that was on the table with?
Right. You see, as you are aware, you're here in the U.S., so you follow the work of the Congress. Congress right now is so focused on the Biden agenda to get the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better agenda, to get that money approved. So right now, I would not be surprised if there's been no movement on the Magnitsky Act. But I expect that once these the bills are concluded and signed into law, that they will start paying more attention to other issues. Right now, they're very focused on getting these bills through Congress.
Got it. And in the interim, we're just going to keep pressure on the IMF, keeping pressure on the World Bank to have them not support.
Absolutely.
Uganda.
And now you know what we've started. Now, next time we go to protest, you know who should join us now?
Who?
The people of Cameroon. Because the IMF is now saying we're going to pay attention to any money that goes there. The people of Equatorial Guinea and the two other countries that I can't recall who are also mentioned in that Economist article. So now when we go, we're going to have even a larger crowd of people protesting in front of the IMF, and that will also catch their attention, and this is all really thanks to Ugandan activism, and obviously you have to also once again thank NUP for all of this, because these are the kind of protests we should have started a long time ago.
Yeah.
But it's a good thing we're doing it now, and it's having impact. So let's continue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Milton, for all your contributions, for being with me on this show. My pleasure. And to our viewers, we want to continue to say thank you for coming with us, coming to join us on the show when we air. We want to, every show we have, actions for our viewers to take. And throughout this show, we've talked about, keeping pressure on the IMF, keeping pressure on the World Bank, also letting your representatives and your senators know, writing to them, calling them, and continuing to petition, continuing to, come together in your chapters, in your groups, and really keeping the pedal to the metal is what they say, keeping
Absolutely.
the pedal to the metal. It occurs to me, Milton, that we're about to reach that tipping point. We're coming
Absolutely.
to that tipping point where eventually everything, boom, tips over and we get our victory as expected. So again, thank you for being with me, Milton.
My pleasure.
You're always very welcome to be on the show.
Thank you. I'm at your service, in the service of sisters and brothers in Uganda.
Absolutely.
Until victory, and we will succeed. Thank you so much.
I feel like saying amen, so I'm going to say amen to that.
Thank you, Carmen.
And to our viewers, continue doing what you're doing, love up on each other, continue to maintain social distance because we're still in a pandemic. For those of you who have lost loved ones, our hearts go out to you. For people who are in the hospitals. We will continue to pray for you and pray with your families. And we are still continuing to petition for the release of all political prisoners.
Yes.
Political prisoners in Uganda, political prisoners in Burma, political prisoners wherever they are, as these are the hunters for justice around the world. So again, I say thank you for being with me here in the studio. David Chirabida is not here with us, but he's with us in spirit. I want to thank our producers, our cameramen, our writers. Again, my name is Judith Bukenya. This is You Voice. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You are watching AI TV. AI TV